For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bree Perkins. I am the Learning and Development Coordinator for Human Resources in the Center for Excellence Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship. Woo! The too long didn't read version of that is I am your trainer for a lot of different things. And you usually see me doing a lot of technology trainings, but today I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is course design. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do to make the designing of a brand new course, or even a course that you're already teaching, a little bit easier. So I want to start out with one of my favorite quotes from my favorite, Steve Jobs, who I think is one of the most brilliant design minds in the field. He says, design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. And there's nothing more true of that than when we're talking about education. So when we're talking about a classroom, design is not just what it looks like. It's not the bells, the whistles, the graphics you put in there. It's how it functions, how people actually learn and engage with that content. So we're going to talk about a few different models. But before I do that, I want to talk about common myths of instructional design. And for those of you who don't know what instructional design is, it's kind of that pairing of meeting the content with the best way to implement it. And there are actually positions out there called instructional designers that are people who help take your content, use the content creator, and move you to the next level. Because a lot of us, you go through master's, you go through a PhD, you learn the content very well, you may be an expert in neuroscience, but when you come to actually teaching and getting from a classroom, it's terrifying because students are terrifying. So this is a good way to kind of get rid of that fear and to get that design going. So the common myths, the first one is, I'm going to lose my academic freedom. I hear this a lot, especially when you're working with somebody in an instructional design field. What ends up happening is people think, oh my gosh, they're going to try to change all my content. I'm going to lose the ability to choose my activities. And that's so not true. And we're going to go into why that is in just a moment. Also, it's just a way of making my content look pretty. Like I mentioned before, it's not just about how it looks and how it feels, it's about how it works. And that is entirely true when it comes to instructional design. It will make my class feel too cookie cutter, especially when we hear things thrown around like master template or master course. People think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have the same look and feel of everybody else's course. And you can have a lot of flexibility within instructional design principles to make your course feel good. And you have to address all the learning styles at once. And when you're a brand new instructional designer, this is like the first mistake, because you hear all these things like, oh, I've got to make sure I do universal design. I've got to work with, their students that only learn via video or via text, or they have to write papers. I have to make sure I make activities that work for everybody. If you do that, you will lose your mind. You cannot please every learning style and every person. You can try. There's a way that you can diversify your learning activities, but there are programs and there are things inside our classrooms that will sometimes work best when we're actually talking about a writing assignment or project-based. So there are sometimes that the mode that you're in, you just have to do it. And there are things that we want our students to learn. So if we say that every discussion board should be video-based as opposed to writing, are we really teaching them how to critically write in a discussion format, an academic writing setting where it's not a paper? So you don't have to address all the learning styles at once. So we're going to start with some of the models. And I always say, let's start with why. And this is the principle of backward design. So when you sit down at the beginning of your class, what do you first do? When you're designing a course, what is the first thing that you do? This is interactive. I don't know. I'm going to make you talk. Looks like we have a chat here. Perfect. So what is the first, and Dr. Tran, I see you're online as well, so feel free to chime in. What is the first thing you do when you're designing your class?
You asked me?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I look at the learning outcomes.
Learning outcomes.
Yeah, what learning outcomes I want. Like at the end of the class, the end of the semester, what do I want them to take away?
That is like the perfect answer. I swear you've already been through this training, because this is amazing, because that's exactly, and for those of you joining us online, the answer was, I start with my learning outcomes. So when you're first starting with the class, you want to ask yourself, and that's what learning outcomes are, but why? What should a student coming into my class take away? So if they're stepping into that class and paying a certain amount, what should they take away from that? What experience, what skills should they come out of it with? Why should they be there? Why should they sign up for your class? And that's what backward design is. And a lot of folks don't know that they're actually using a lot of these models already without even knowing it. So let's talk a little bit about backward design, how it works. So as I was mentioning before, the first thing you want to do, determine what a student should get out of your class. So what should they get out of your class? When they're signing up, when they're paying for it, at the end of the semester, what should they walk away with? And that's really the essence of what we do when we're teaching. Also, figure out how you're going to assess those outcomes. So it's not just enough to ask why. How are you going to measure it to make sure that they are reaching those outcomes? How do you know that students are actually leaving there with it? And then the third step in that is you're going to create activities and content that directly tie to that outcome. So you want to make sure it's backwards design, because instead of starting with the activity, instead of going, I want them to write a paper, you're going to talk about, I want them to know how to critically analyze ethics of research. Then I want to figure out, I'm going to do a paper to assess, and I'm going to assess that using a rubric, using a scale, and communicating that with my students. So that's backward design in a nutshell. Questions so far? All right. So activity time. Let's try it out. So I want you to think about a course that you currently have, that you're currently working on, and I want you to think about one of your outcomes, any outcome that you have. So go forth, any outcome that you have. Go ahead, off the top of your head.
Yeah. Understanding what sports psychology is.
Understand what sports psychology, what it is and what it isn't. Perfect. So they should have a good grasp of what is sports psychology as opposed to just the word, what does it mean? So let's talk about activities. So how would you assess that first? How would you assess whether they know what sports psychology is?
So having a test, for example, to see if they can define the definition that we're using, the working definition for sports psychology.
So can they define it? Okay. So what kind of activity would we do to make sure that they can define it? This is where the hard part comes in.
So different activities that are part of sports psychology. So doing imagery, visualization, pre-performance routines, doing these things throughout the class, and then having, for example, either A, like a test where they write it down, or B, where they teach it to their classmates.
I love that second one there, where they teach it, where they have to then take the content, flip it on its head, and not just know it, not just regurgitate that fact, but then teach it. There is nothing stronger than having to teach content back because you feel you have to have a mastery of that. So that in a nutshell is backward design that you were able to do in 3 minutes there. You take your outcome, you look at how you're going to assess it, you build the activity, you rinse and repeat throughout your course. And that ties right in to what's called the ADDIE model. Have you ever heard of the ADDIE model before? First time. Ooh, I get to teach you something, one of my favorite concepts, the ADDIE model. So the ADDIE model looks a little bit like this, and you're going to see it in different charts and different pyramids, and they show it in a lot of different representations. I like circles. I like bubbles. The reason for it is not a linear model. And this is the number one mistake people make when they come into design is they look at the ADDIE model and think, I have to analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. I go through the lines like a conveyor belt. That's not how learning is designed and how it works. So we're going to start and go through each of these steps here in a linear model, but keep in mind, you can start and go back and forth. So sometimes I may start with developing and go back and analyze and then design and go back and implement. And I'm constantly going through this circular motion here. And you notice that all of these bubbles fit into evaluate. At every single stage of the line, you will always be evaluating. So let's take a look. So analysis, which is the first A. So the A in ADDIE is analysis. You want to ask yourself, who's your audience? And this applies not just for a class you're teaching. This could be for a training that you're doing. This could be for a project that you're doing. The ADDIE model works a lot for project management as well. So who is your audience? What are your delivery options? Can you do it online? Does it have to be in person? Does it have to be synchronous? Can it be asynchronous? Can it be project-based, an internship? So what are your delivery options for that learning? What's your timeline? How long do they have to complete that? Should it be done in a week, a day, a year, 5 years, 2 years, a PhD program, 30 years? So what's your timeline? And then what are your goals? So we're talking about that outcome. Backward design is not separated from the ADDIE model. Even though they're two separate models, they work in tandem. So when we're talking about outcomes and goals, that's why it's right there at the beginning. What are your goals of this? What are you trying to achieve? What is the why? And what do you need? Like, it's wonderful. I could say that I want to train everybody how to use Google on every platform all across the world. I kind of need stuff to do that though. So what resources do you need to accomplish that? And that's part of the analysis. And like I said, this is happening at every stage of the game. You're always constantly asking yourself, who is my audience? What are my goals? Am I reaching those? The next step in that is the D, design. So what strategies, oh, I got a misspelling there, but what strategies will you use? So how will you get to those goals? So we talked about a little bit in backward design of how we move. We talk about assessment. We talk about these activities that we're making. This is part of the design. And how do we link those learning objectives, the learning outcomes and activities all together? What testing and assessment will you use? So how are we going to, like I said, with backward design, and we're implementing it right at the stage. And how will you scaffold the learning? So how are you going to grow that learning? If you're looking at a timeline, if it's a linear progression of learning, how are you building? Are you building off a module? Is every single module separated? How does that look? The next D in ADDIE is develop. So now you actually got to do it. So this is the hard part. So it's great to think about the theoretical and going, oh, this is amazing. I love this. But when you're talking about develop, I actually got to make the content. And this is like, we write it in really simple terms from an instructional design standpoint. This, I think, is like the hardest part of the entire project, is actually coming up with the content to meet those outcomes and those goals. Creating your course layout. How does it look? Are you doing modules? Are you doing weeks? Are you doing months? Are you doing project-based? What does your course layout look like? Create a prototype. So even if you're not teaching, you can actually start developing courses ahead of time. You can pilot them with other staff that you're working with other faculty. It's okay to get feedback even before you launch it in your classroom. And review. Like I said, you're always evaluating, you're always looking at it. What does it look like? Take a good, fine look at it. The I, and again, this is probably the second hardest part, is actually implementing it. So you have your course designed, it's beautiful, it's perfect, it's pristine, it's wonderful. Now we actually got to teach it. So this is what you guys do best, is you guys go into the classroom, you go into a training model, you go into anywhere else, and you do it. You actually engage with your students, you're putting it into action, you're seeing how these activities, how these resources, how all of your content works in the wild. And then, as I mentioned before, this happens at every single stage, the evaluate. You are always, always evaluating. And this is the one takeaway from today, is that you are always evaluating what you're doing. And it's not just an assessment piece. It's also just getting feedback. So get feedback from your students. And there are three critical parts of the feedback that you want to look for. Perception. So even though we may have a course, let's say you're teaching statistics, and I will be honest, statistics is fun for like the 1% of the nerdy people in the world that love teaching it, and then like awful for the other 99% of us that hate numbers or anything else. So you want to make sure that the perception there, even if you have the best course design in there, how are your students perceiving it? Are they seeing it as too much work, not enough work? If so, how can you as the instructor, if you know it's enough work, if you know it's the right amount, how can you change that perception? How are they learning? So do you have class failing, or if you have class succeeding? You'll know pretty quickly whether your course design is working. And performance. So how is it working in the wild? Is it efficient? Do you find you're running into roadblocks? Do you find certain activities just don't work? So you want to get these three different areas: perception, learning, and performance. So that was the ADDIE model. Any questions about ADDIE?
When you talked about, you said developing is the hardest stage.
Yes,
right? You said,
in my opinion. That's an opinion. Oh,
right?
yes.
And you talked about generating the content, and then, okay, so it's getting feedback was in a different section.
It is.
Evaluation. Would you think that getting feedback when you're in that developmental stage could be helpful in terms of facilitating more effective?
Absolutely. And that's why when I talk about ADDIE and the getting feedback was in the evaluate stage, is that I say it's not linear for a reason, because all of these stages interact at all given points. Like you could be sitting in your office and do all of these stages in one day at any given point. So, or wherever you decide to do course design. I assume it happens in an office. It could happen by a lake. I don't know. But you could say, you know, if I'm getting feedback and I'm doing a prototype and I'm developing it and working with another faculty member to kind of bounce around ideas, I want their feedback. I want to evaluate at every point. I also want to evaluate, did I get my audience right? Do I have a good understanding of that? So that's why I put evaluate in the biggest bubble of all, because I think at every single stage, you need to constantly be reflecting back and saying, is this working? Will this work for me in the future? Good point. I know, a lot to take in. What the good news is a lot of you are actually doing this already. And I want to talk about the practical aspects. We're kind of going from macro level down to micro here. So we talked about backward design being kind of the logic behind starting with outcomes. We talked about now the ADDIE model, which is the process of course design in a whole. But let's talk about Bloom's. Are you familiar with Bloom's taxonomy? Oh, I love it when people say yes, because I'm like a Bloom's nerd. This is where I get really excited. This is actually how to take the content and activities and move it into the next level. So how are we taking it to that next level there? So Bloom's taxonomy looks a little bit like this. And again, this is one of those models, if you throw it into Google, you're gonna see like 400,000 different versions of it. But this is the essential layout of what you should be trying to achieve. So if I'm working at a project, maybe I'm writing a paper, there are different ways that I can hit different levels, and you always want to hit that top level if you can. So at the very basic, you have what's called remember. This is going to be like what we did in 4th grade social studies. You read a book, you read a chapter, and they tell you, you know, when was the Civil War? Who was our first president? Who was the 15th president? You know, what happened this? You're just regurgitating facts. Google can do that now, which is why it's not a hugely critical resource. It is critical though, however, when you need to build off from this. So this is why it's a pyramid. It is your foundation. You do have to be able to remember facts. So if I was teaching something like anatomy and physiology, I would sure as hell want to know that they know the bones in the hand before they start thinking about how to dissect said hand. So you do want to make sure that there is a remember aspect to it, but you don't want to stop there. The next one is understanding. Can they actually explain the concepts back to you? So even like a paraphrasing aspect of this. So instead of just regurgitating said fact, it's no longer a fill in the blank. Can they explain the concept? So if I was talking about sports psychology, can they explain what sports psychology is? That would be in that understand category. Do you understand that category? Apply. Can you use that information in a new situation? Can you actually solve or demonstrate or interpret? You'll see a lot of these key words underneath each block here. So can I demonstrate my knowledge? Can I schedule or sketch it? Can I put it in a different mode besides just telling you or summarizing? Can I move it into a different mode? Analyze. Can I draw the connections? Now we're getting into the fun stuff. So this is actually where courses start to get exciting for students too. You'll find as you go up through Bloom's, students get more engaged. It's harder. I will give you that. It is exponentially harder on a student to get up this Bloom's ladder, and it's harder for you as an instructor to make Bloom's high-level activities. But the analyze means, can I take all of these individual concepts that I understand and I've been able to apply, and can I make a synthesis between them? Can I understand them as a whole? How do they apply? My favorite, evaluate. Now, can you argue on behalf of that? Do you have an emotion, a feeling? Can you debate on that topic? Can you get past that point of just understanding and synthesizing? Can you take a stance? Now, I mentioned before how I loved how you were talking about having them create, and that is the top level of Bloom's. So one of my favorite activities that an instructor has me do in my master's program is they have me go through the chapters instead of just reading and regurgitating in this low-level Bloom's. They actually have me create a quiz of multiple choice questions based on the content of that. I am the type of student that if the reading doesn't have something I have to do for a grade, if it doesn't interest me, I ain't doing it because I don't have time for that. And so what would happen is when they tell me to regurgitate, I skim through, I find what I need to regurgitate it back, I remember, good, check marks, good to go. When this instructor created the multiple choice, the generate multiple choice questions quiz, I now have to create. I no longer just have to remember, I actually have to understand the concepts as a whole. I have to know what I'm talking about, or I know I'm going to look really stupid if I make a multiple choice question and I barely know how to remember. I need to get to that create. This also is really good for project work. So if we're talking about things like papers are fun. That's a way of creating. However, projects are a way to tap into the create. I see the face back there too. Papers are a very low level creation, very low level creation. When we're talking about creativity, and I talked about how you don't have to hit every learning model at once or every learning style at once, creating helps meet that need. You could create websites as a project. So instead of just talking about a sports psychology, maybe I want them to, instead of understanding just what sports psychology is, I want them to take that stance that they made back in the second level of evaluate and actually create a website. Create a PowerPoint and present it. I want you then to also be able to evaluate, analyze, bring those in and teach it to a class. Can you teach back that content to me? Can you create a video? Interpretive dance. There are lots of ways. And interpretive dance, I say loosely, it doesn't work for every topic on there. A puzzle. Can you create a puzzle? There's different ways that you can tap into that. So you're essentially looking at these keywords: design, assemble, construct, conjecture, develop, formulate, author, investigate. Experiment. Can you create your own experiment? Can you create your own, even if I'm teaching basic undergrad research methods, I might want to look at, can you create your own experiment with controls in place, independent variables, dependent variables? They not only now have to define what a dependent variable is and an independent variable is, they have to do it. They don't actually have to do the experiment, but they have to design it. So this is a good way of getting you up to the top level. And I see we have in chat here that I did this for my grad research methods classes as extra credit. They developed exam questions bank and the good ones that may be used and included in their exam. Students love the exercise and it helped them learn the material. Absolutely. It's a good way of engaging, because I will tell you, I went from hating reading and doing that, generating multiple questions, to actually having fun doing it. I look forward to like making this weird little quiz at the end of every week, because I'm like, I'm going to throw a real doozy in there. That's fun. Students are cruel because guess what? They're the ones that have taken tests for most of their life and are actively taking tests. They see every single model inside there, and there's ways. So let's talk about how we can implement Blooms with digital tools. So when I talk about digital technology as a whole, so people tend to shoehorn it into their classes and go, I have an iPad, therefore it must work. I have this device, I must use it. That's not how you want to do it. You actually want to base it inside Bloom. So there's different activities you can do with digital tools. So again, this is that same Bloom's pyramid, but now we're looking at boxes as opposed to pyramids. Woohoo, boxes. So basic level of remembering. Here's some of the activities you could do. I know we love our boxes at the Center for Teaching. Boxes, bubbles, and buttons. We're all about it. For first level of remembering, you can. We're a cube society there. So we have a base level of remembering. This may be something you see a lot in classes. You have to bookmark something. You have to copy it down. Maybe they highlight something, or they have to search for something. It doesn't require a lot of mental power. I could probably do it while I'm watching a Netflix show. So if you can do it while you're watching Netflix, you know you're at the bottom of Blooms. If I have to turn Netflix off, you know you've got up to the high level. Second is understanding. Journaling. You can actually use tweeting inside your class. So this is something that some folks don't even think about, of integrating in social media in a meaningful way. If they need to tweet about something, guess what? They don't want to make a fool of themselves in front of their friends either. They can tweet about a topic that they're working on. Tagging, can you tag it? Can you create hashtags for it? Subscribing to it. Now we're getting to the fun stuff. Applying. Can you calculate, chart it, edit it, upload it? So this is going to be how I apply the information. And this is the top 3 levels is really where you want to be. So analyzing. Can you create a mind map? A survey. Can you survey a population? Can you link to something else? Linking between different concepts. Can you validate what another person is saying and why? So it's drawing back that global scale. Talking about evaluating, have them grade each other. So can they grade each other effectively? Keep in mind, if they're grading each other, you always want to keep a little eyeball on that because of weird little grading strategies. But this is a good way of getting them interactive with each other and their content, and getting understanding what other people know as well. Can they test well? So that's another evaluation. Can they make posts or moderate another discussion? And then my favorite is the create. If you can go up to this top level of Blooms, your class will be on fire. Students will love being in your class. It's going to be hard. You will probably get on your Cert 2s that this is the hardest class I've ever taken, but I had fun doing it. So when we're talking about creating, here's some of the instances of using technology. Blogging. So creating a blog about topics inside the class. Again, we're talking about creating a website. You can do something like Google Sites, Wix, you could do WordPress. There are free blogging utilities out there that they have access to. Have them do a running blog each week. about a topic. Another favorite activity I've seen from my master's program so far is that we have where we go out based on the topic of that week. So if we're talking about cognition during that week, or we want to talk about embodied models, we may actually go in and look at other articles and current events and bring them back to the class and talk about them. So we as the students have to go out, know what we're talking about, know enough what we're talking about, go find a current event. So like we may pull in articles about AI. We may pull in articles about the ethics of different cognitive models. And what's cool about this is then we have a discussion about it. So we are getting all these resources from 30 people all over the class, bringing in all these fun internet sites that we would read probably in our free time and actually talking about them. You could do a blog the same way. Podcasting. Can they create their own podcast? Podcasting's fun. It doesn't have to be a video. It could be actually just audio. And you'll be surprised of how creative and nerdy your students get very quickly when it comes to podcasting. So this is allowing them to talk about the content that they're doing. And directing. Can they direct somebody else? Can you do a video? Can they make a short little video clip? I had a class that I worked with recently over in the traditional side of the campus here that was looking at having their students create commercials, 30-second commercials on the topic. We brought in iPads, we shot the videos in one day, and we edited them in one day, and they had a whole another class, they presented them, they were awesome. They worked in teams of 2 or 3. So we're talking a high level of creation there. So I want to open up the last half hour or so. I know there's not a lot of you here with us, but I want to talk about what you do in your course design and what works well and what you think that could work better. So no pressure. And I do have,
Hey, Bree.
I do have a question online too. She says that my undergraduate students are doing an acted out skit. Any suggestions on how to debrief on it? Ooh, very good question. So if you're doing it acted out skit.
Chime in on the video. I mean, I realize I typed really. Can you hear me, Bree?
I can.
Okay.
And the whole room can hear you, which is awesome too. So it's like we're all in one room together.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mia, just to introduce myself since you can't see me. I skit. So they receive a topic and then they have to create a dilemma, a scenario, and act it out, and then use strategies and ask the class to develop discussions and strategies around that scene. So it's like if they're watching something on video, but instead they're the one developing it, and they're the one creating the kind of discussion and learning outcome points. I'm just curious of what's a good debriefing. I haven't done it yet. The first scene will be next week.
Good question. So for a debrief on that, so we're looking at ways to evaluate their knowledge and make sure that the other students are also getting the knowledge from that. You could actually have a rating system that they have to develop. So maybe you have the class come together and as a universal entity, they develop some sort of rating system of how to assess each other for these skits. And you'll find that students actually do a fairly good job knowing where to assess each other. You, of course, want to also give feedback to them on your side of things, but then what they can do is as they're watching these skits, they have that assessment in mind. They're looking at these key points, and as they're developing their own skits, they have these assessments in mind. So that might be a good strategy to use to make sure you can debrief on it. And then come back and have a discussion. So what were some of the salient points? What were some of the critical topics that you guys found inside these skits? And what would you like to talk about further? Get them in some sort of controversial debate even. So sometimes, and I don't know which class this is, but I saw one for a research methods class that talked about ethics. And they pulled in a current event about is human research or is market research human research, which is a hot topic right now because Facebook and OkCupid are under some legal fire for running data on their users without informing their users. There's no informed consent, and they're actually publishing this as research. So you could have a really good debate in class just by getting some sort of little controversial nugget like that, throwing it out to the class and watching them debate. Because what's cool about that is they have to also understand what are these ethics? What is an IRB? Why do we have ethics in place to even have that conversation? So we're building off of that. Good question.
Mia, can she hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mia, have you checked out after action reviews?
No, I don't know what that is.
Okay, so the so that'd be something worth looking into. After action reviews, the military use them, and then different organizations use them, and it helps with figuring out like what you did well, why, and then what you can do better and how going forward. And immediately following like that that situation.
Very cool. I like this. After
Is this
action.
something that I share with them and they see, or is this something just for me?
Both.
Okay.
The second question I had for you is, you mentioned doing skits, so is it like a role play?
Yeah, so they decide what roles they want, what scenario, what context, and they have an option to either act it out in class or pre-record it and we watch it in class.
Have you ever had them use real situations that are going on in their life versus doing something, doing a skit like they're actually experiencing it currently or did in the past?
Actually, this is my first time using this exercise. So I've never done it before. And I love that idea of asking them to kind of create a scenario, like create the skit around a personal experience. I like that idea. I didn't think about that.
Yeah. So the reason I'm bringing it up is I was just reading about that and like the difference between the level of engagement, the learning, and also the emotion behind it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we know if it's fake and we just got to put that on,
Yeah.
like different in terms of retention of knowledge than if like, okay, I'm talking about something that I experienced, 3 years ago.
What's nice about that too, when you're talking real world experience, one of the hurdles students get at in college especially is that they think that what you're learning only exists in the classroom. You're never going to see this in the real world. Unless we're talking some grads programs and things like that, you're looking at, they know they're going to the professional field there. But with undergrads specifically in like at the 101 level, they're thinking, I'm never going to use this again. I'm just getting this for my course credit. When you're talking real world experience there, even if they themselves are not experiencing it, if somebody else is sharing that it's happening to them in the real world, they're going to know it's a real thing and it's going to be more meaningful. Like you said, the key takeaways are awesome.
Yeah, like you were talking about, agree with the reading.
Mm-hmm.
Like where you're going, well, all right, this is just what I have to do,
Mm-hmm.
regurgitate it versus create. Now I think you're thinking deeper and more critically while you're reading.
Right.
So you're not just going through something, you're trying to get something out of it.
And you have a product. When we're talking about create, we also want to get our students ready for the workforce. Like they're going to go out to the real world and the job market is competitive right now. I mean, super competitive. If you don't come in with a portfolio for an entry-level job, sometimes they won't even hire you. They won't even consider you. You won't even get in for an interview. So what you can do is when you have them create, they're now creating products that they can incorporate in a portfolio to bring to an employer. Go, I have made a website. I have made a podcast. I have made this video. I know how to do these skills, and these are applicable to what I'm going to do for your company. I like this this after action review too. Just looking at this resource here, and I can send this over to you, Mia. That way we have.
That'd be perfect. I was just thinking that.
I'll put this in chat for you, so that way you have this link.
So a friend of mine was a Navy SEAL, and I asked him, we were having breakfast together in August, and I asked him, I said, what do you think separates the Navy SEALs from every other special forces military branch around the world? He didn't even hesitate. And he said, it's our debriefing process. And he was talking about after action review. And then he went into detail. And then I asked him to share it with the other people around the table 2 hours later. Mm-hmm. And everyone was blown away with his description on why they do it, how they do it, and the consistency at which it's used. So a lot of organizations will do this, say, quarterly, annually, monthly maybe, right? Mm-hmm. And he said what separates the Navy SEALs from every other special forces branches, they do it daily.
Really?
It's their commitment to doing it daily. So immediately I started doing this, implementing this with our tennis programs here at the school. And it's been really fascinating.
Do you implement it in your classes where you start out and then say, what would you like? And then at the end, what worked well, what didn't? Have you tried that yet?
Yeah. So I'm figuring out how to, so yes.
Yeah.
So I'm figuring out how to mix that in
Gotcha.
to every class. Yeah, to embed that inside the class.
Now, would you do this like every day, or is this something you would do for specific projects?
Every day.
That's really cool. I like this because that also creates a culture of feedback, which is severely lacking not just in our schools, but also in companies as well. We see this a lot of, even in our own Springfield College environment, is that we don't ask for feedback because we're afraid of it. And so when we do actually give feedback, it seems like we're trying to penalize somebody. So when we're creating this culture of feedback like that, where it's a daily occurrence, people are going to speak their mind and you're going to be able to address issues. Like I said, evaluate happens at every stage of the game. This is a way of incorporating that evaluation stage. You're getting feedback and you're able to adjust and redevelop as you go instead of having to wait until next term to fix the major issues that are happening. I love this. This is awesome. You always come with like some of the best resources. Other things that you guys find are working well in your class. I'm going to throw the AAR right back at you. What works well, what doesn't?
Yeah, so what's worked well is twofold. One, getting them to twofold. So one, getting them to discuss ideas and like you're talking about, debate more informally than formally. Two is having them learn about an idea from their classmates and then have to teach that, or like you're talking about scaffolding, teach that next section back to the rest of the class.
Gotcha.
Just like they're collaborating together on their learning.
So it's almost like you have an arrow going up and an arrow going down at the same time. So you are constantly not just teaching it, but you're also reinforcing it.
Right.
So it's moving both ways at once. I like that.
Because when you teach something, you get to learn it twice.
Gotcha.
And if you feel that you have to, all learning is state dependent, emotional state. So if you feel that you're like, what I'm learning right now, I'm going to have to teach that at 12 o'clock. I'm going to have a different level of emotional intensity and concentration and focus than if I'm like, okay, is this even going to be on the test?
Yeah.
And anything times 0 is 0.
You also bring in, and I'm talking to two psychology professors here, so I'm preaching to the choir, but when you're talking about the emotional state and you're talking about the adrenaline, you're talking about ways that if you're putting people in a situation where they have to teach back, there's higher stakes.
Right.
And so they're going to remember it because if you have all those emotions, you have that response going into play. So preachers of the choir, like I said, you guys are both psychology experts. So, but it's a good way of reinforcing that. Other things you find that maybe don't work well, or things that you saw in this model that you don't agree with?
Don't agree with. I'd say the challenge for me is I don't know about don't agree with, but the challenge for me is like coming up with activities where that creation level to elevate the learning, so to create moments of elevation that then they can run with. So exploring that, like different activities that challenge them.
There is this wonderful graphic, I almost included in my presentation here, of different activities you can use for each level of blooms. And there is a lot inside. Let's see if I can actually pull it up bigger here. But what they talk about is like, if you want to get to create, what are some of the things you can do? Now, obviously not everybody is a coder. They're not going to be able to like create a video game necessarily, but you could still bring gamified elements and have them create their own game. I know Nancy, our graduate associate's in the room, who's actually doing her thesis on gamification. So that is, it's a way of, you really have to learn the content, don't you, Nancy, to be able to create a game for what you're doing. Yeah. Websites, yeah. And it's fun. Like there's a part of it. I mean, probably you don't see the fun just yet, but it's fun. But also things like stories. Like if you create a storyboard, just like you don't have to write it, but you don't have to be an artist to make a storyboard of what you want to do. So I know, Mia, you were talking about the skits. One way of doing that on kind of a different level, if you didn't want to take up class time for performing them, is to have them storyboard out what a skit would be. So there's a lot of different activities on this wheel, and you can see if you just go into Google and type in Bloom's Wheel of Activities, there's a lot of different institutions that will make this kind of wheel that will tell you what kinds of things you can do, from analogies, graphs, posters, diagrams, puzzles, cartoons, film strips. There's a lot of activities out there. Ooh, I like that. So the suggestion Nancy had, just to repeat it, so that she was in the back of the room, is to have students, give them a menu and have them choose activities that they think would be meaningful for them. I like that. It's you can bring it up to them and be like, we're talking about this. What activity do you think would best fit your style? Now, keep in mind, like I was mentioned before, not every learning, you'll never hit every learning model in every style. There are sometimes we have to have them write a paper. That's understandable.
Well,
but
Bree,
go ahead.
My only concern with that suggestion is that students in gender, you know, the one that are really engaged and want to learn will more likely challenge themselves in selecting these activities. And then there's students who don't. And then there's the concern is they're tapping into the activities that are, or they select the ones that are not as challenging and they're more at the lower level of learning, of not wanting to kind of move up. So
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One way you can kind of counteract that is to provide, say, over the course of the semester, you have to do one of each of the following types of activities. So you have to have one of the high level, the low level. You can choose what topic you do that for. So like if I want to know that we're talking about intro to psych and we're talking about ethics, what is psychology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they want to do the high level one at an introductory module and then leave one of the lower stakes ones at the higher modules. So you can say, but you have to hit 3 or 4 of these over the course of the semester. But again, you'll know your class better than anybody. So this will not work for everybody.
Yeah, like okay, saying that child, you have to eat a green vegetable, but it doesn't have to be asparagus. They can choose broccoli, they can choose a
exactly. They're still going to eat a vegetable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, Dr. Tran says hi, Nancy. She said hello.
Yeah, tell her she's talking about these gamification study. I'm like, I hope these are not your participants.
Yeah, so you'll see a lot of different activities in there. But again, that is the struggle when it comes to finding activities that work for your class. But that's the hard part.
Well, and Mia, I think your point really is like our challenge as teachers, right? Is how do we design a course, a class, in an environment where people will select not off the path of least resistance, but off the path of most resistance?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you find the answer, let me know.
I love how you phrase that. Having them find the path of, like, want to find the path of most resistance. And that's really getting them to feel passionate about the topic. And that goes back to backward design of why. If you can, and there's a really good, I know you probably heard of Simon Sinek, who talks about the golden circle. It's a lot of marketing strategies that actually work best are the ones that explain why as opposed to what at the beginning. And you are selling your students on what you're teaching. That's the short and skinny of that, is that you are actually selling whatever you're teaching to your students and going, you have to be passionate about this. It's not a have to be, why should you be passionate about this? I'm not just telling you what psychology is, I'm telling you why psychology matters. So that when you take and think of it in that frame of mind, students, especially our age group, we are way more prone to looking at a why. That's why you look at Tom's Shoes is a good example. They came out and said, you know, we're not just making great shoes. We are making shoes that make a difference. And everybody who in our age group went, hooray, I'm going to buy a pair of Toms, except for they're kind of ugly, so I probably won't. I have a pair, so I can say that. But this is something where we're talking about the why, the rationale behind it. We do the same thing with our class every day. If you can convince the students why it should matter to them, we are, as students, as people, are self-interested. That's how we are designed. So if we can go and teach to that selfish interest inside of each and every one of us, then we're going to succeed. That's the hard part, though. It's really catchy when you say it as a why, but it's really one of the harder parts. Other comments, questions, concerns, hopes, dreams, or aspirations?
So, Bree, when you talked about in the ADDIE model,
Mm-hmm.
Evaluation and measuring perception,
Mm-hmm.
what are some creative ways you found to measure the audience's perception?
I tend to go back to looking at sales and marketing. That's kind of like my niche. When you look at sales and marketing, when we're trying to look at how a customer comes into a store and perceives the experience that they have, we look at what's called Net Promoter. It's a scale of 10. And we look at, would you recommend this to somebody else? Would you recommend, well, how likely are you to recommend this is what Net Promoter is based on. And you can have a bunch of different ways to measure that. Usually it's a Likert scale. But you can say, how likely are you to recommend this module? Did you feel like you learned it? What did you perceive? And you can even ask an anonymous feedback. You know, did you find this course hard? Did you find it worthwhile? Was it worth your time? I think that is one of the top principles for students is it worth my time? Time is exceptionally limited, especially when you're talking adult learners or working students. Time is the most valuable asset they have. And even at an undergrad level, time seems to be the most valuable resource. They don't care about what tuition costs. They're already paying that. It's what is my time worth? So if you can say, is this worth your time? Was this class, was this content meaningful? Did you feel you gained these skills? Did you feel you learned this? What is your perception? All you got to do is ask. They will be bluntly honest with you, you'll find. And your Cert 2s are actually a good way of looking at that too. So if you look at the comments that you're getting in your Cert 2s, you know, do you see common themes that are coming out of there? So how are they perceiving your class? Some of the hardest classes I've ever taken were some of the most enjoyable classes I've ever taken because of the way that the instructor did it. Did I like statistics? No. Did I love my professor? Did I love the way that course was designed? Did I love the activity she did? Absolutely. She made me love, well, I don't love statistics, but she made me at least tolerate it and understand why it's important to the world. And so now I come at it with a different perspective. And that's all perception. She was able to change my perception through this really rigorous course.
And within the Cert 2s, have you experienced where a teacher asks or you ask every few weeks that type of information to perceive how the students are?
I haven't come across that yet, but I think that would be valuable. You know, I was talking, like I said, evaluates at every stage. And even you were mentioning of doing the AAR at the beginning and end of every class. That's a good way. Once you start getting that culture of feedback going, people are way more likely to give you honest feedback of their perception. They're going to tell you, I think your class is overworked. It's too hard right now. You're combining like 4 classes into one. This model isn't working. I don't like the way you're doing this lecture. They're going to tell you. They have those opinions, whether they're telling them to your face or not. That's the difference. If you look at Rate My Professor, you'll find out. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Tran, for joining us. If you find you have any questions or if you need anything, let me know.